Hello and welcome to another thinkingParticles 7.3 tutorial video. This tutorial video will cover the new features introduced in our latest release, Service Pack 1. The main new addition has been the MEL integration of SplinePool. SplinePool is our powerful thinkingParticles node which allows you to procedurally create and manipulate splines. As with my previous tutorial, MEL plays a central role in creating the effect you just saw in this video. Just as a reminder, this video is not scripted, things happen in real time, and rendering, recording, and simulation is done on the same machine. Before we dive into the scene setup, let's have a look how the scene looks like. Let me just play back, and what you can see here right now are splines drawn and they are whirling somehow around the center, moving around, whirling around, doing all kinds of interesting movements. And this is the setup as we have it now. And what you're seeing there are splines drawn by thinkingParticles and the new SplinePool function controlled via MEL. So let me just stop that right here and let's have a look how we did the setup for this effect. And in this video, I will do more an explainer video, so I won't build the scene from scratch. So I'll just explain how it works and why we did the things we did. So let me bring up the thinkingParticles user interface. So we have our first dynamic set called create. Just for the explanation part, I will turn off the MEL dynamic set. So this will give us only right now the create dynamic set which is active. So I'll just reset the simulation and we can see right now there's nothing to see because we need to turn on the particles. We want to see the particles. So I'll turn on the particle view. So now we see the particles as little dots. And we can see something is happening over time. We get more and more particles. And then the creation of new particles slows down again. So let me just replay that once more. In the beginning, we have very few particles popping up, then very large amount of particles, and that's it. So how did we do that? In thinkingParticles, I'm using the time base, and this is nothing else than just spitting out the frame number. So I'll get into our ValueToValue, one of the most powerful nodes we have, and most flexible nodes you can use in all kinds of situations. So we feed in the frame number, so that actually means at which frame we are. We feed in the frame number, and the frame number goes from 0 to 500. This animation has 500 frames. So our minimum would be 0, maximum 500. So everything is referenced here. So if we have 0 to 1, it means 0 to 500 and so on. Or for the outputs, the other way around, we give it a minimum output and a maximum output. And what we are controlling with the ValueToValue is our particle birth rate. So the birth rate is going up, kept very low at the minimum, 10 particles per second. And then it's jumping up to the max value, 500 per second. It holds it for some time, and then it drops down to 10 particles per second again. So all we do here is just controlling procedurally the input for particles per second. So we're controlling how many particles are created per second in this animation. And this is exactly what's happening. We start slow, as we can see here. We start slow with a few dots here. Then we ramp up to our maximum, hold that for some time, create a lot of amounts of particles, and then we drop down and stop creating new particles. So this is the setup we have for the ValueToValue. However, what is causing the particles to move around? And you might think, oh, it must be in the other dynamic set. But that's only half of the story. What we did here is we brought in a OpenVDB velocity field. Let me just go here. So the first thing when you want to work with OpenVDB is you need to create a container where you store your grid or your velocity field. And we create a velocity field here. So this is our container. And now this container is ready to receive. We are a load VDB. So we are loading a VDB file. And we are loading this into the velocity channel. So we are loading from a hard drive OpenVDB velocity field. And then let me just show you, I'll enable the display of our velocity field. And as you can see here, we have some nice, really nice velocity values in here. And our velocity we get from the file are in the very low numbers, around 0 up to 4950 is our maximum velocity we have in the field here. And this field was created with Final Fluid, so I just exported a moving smoke cloud, and I'll exported the velocities of our smoke fluid there. So I created this in real time, saved it in real time, and there we have something to play around. So we can see where the high velocities are and where the low velocities are. So this is how we get all the velocity field into thinkingParticles. Just the load, and that's it. That's practically all we need to do. So how do we place the particles? That's also very easy and simple. We have our volume dummy. Let me just get the Scene Explorer in here so we can go here and visualize. This is just a sphere. I just created a sphere. I want to have the particles created inside. We use the volume position with a thickness, so the particles are all around the 50 units thickness area. So and that's it. We create the particles random in this area, in this volume. So that's all how we create the particles. So now the tricky part is how can we get from our velocity field, how can we transfer the velocities that are in this field, how can we transfer that to our particles we create here? So if we, let me just play back the animation again. So, and you will notice we create particles when we zoom in here in the regions where we have a velocity value. So that's another thing we want to make sure that we only create particles where there is a field value. So several things we want to achieve here, and let's have a look how we did that. Let me bring up our MEL. So for the MEL, we need to get access to the grid, and we just use the getGrid node from thinkingParticles that allows us to pick the VDB particle that holds the volume, the field, and then we get the velocity out here and we connect it to our MEL script. Next thing is our new SplinePool integration. So we just use a standard thinkingParticles SplinePool. We connect the SplinePool data. So now we have full access to SplinePool, can create knots, can remove knots, can create splines, remove splines, and all this kind of functionality. And then last not least is our trailborn, and that's used, it's a standard node in thinkingParticles as well, and that's used to just drop along a path particles, and we will use these dropped particles as knots in our spline. So and those trailborn particles go into the group spline knots, as we can see here. And then we have the leader knots, that's our leading particle that is drawing the spline, so to say. And the very last thing here is just for grabbing a position from the volume dummy, that is the sphere. I just want to have the center point of this dummy to do some more effects inside of the MEL. So the rest we see here, all the movements, all the animations and stuff we see here are all done with MEL. So we create the particles. Let me just go down here so that we can watch in 3D here. So now I have still the particle points on and the spline display is on. So we can see all the creation of our splines. So let's have a look. How did we do that? How complicated is that? And it's not that complicated. You just have to check a little bit the help file if you start with MEL, but it's not really complicated. We have so many functions and features in there that help you so much in creating this kind of effects. The very first important part, and I want you to get your attention to this upper part here. This is the most important input. The first input, when you create a MEL node, the first input is your most important one. It defines, it sets or decides which values you get in your global variables. So right now we have an input which is our leader particle. The leader particle group is our first input. That means we are processing all the particles in this leader group in parallel. So MEL is called in parallel. So if there's, let's say, 20 particles in there, there will be 20 threads at the same time working with these particles. So this is a little bit you need to wrap your head around. So 20 times this thing is started. Every instance of this thread is getting its particle information, particle position from the particle it is working on. If we have 10,000 particles, it's more multi-threading going on. So every particle gets its world position, speed, and so on. Keep that in mind. The first input you create, this is right now here, leader is our first input. This decides on what we will get in our global variables automatically filled in. Then we have some inputs. We have the spline inputs for the spline nodes, another group. We can also access this group, but no longer in parallel. We would need to go with a serial for loop over the particles if we wanted to do that. Then we input our field, our velocity field. So we open or create this input where we connect our get grid. Then we have a control, a standard control for speed, where we have a speed of -1.5. We want to point it inward to the core. And then we have a generator input for our trail-borne particles and a center void control that will kill all particles that are close to the center. I have in my setup a light source in the center, so I want to keep that light source still visible. So that's from the main setup. So we create the inputs, and now let's see how we access all these great data we have there. So first thing is I create a variable up here which holds our field velocity values. So velocity is a vector 3. So I'll prepare a variable for our field velocity. So we want to read from the OpenVDB field the velocities and transfer this velocity to our particles. Then I have another variable that just controls how strong my force is to drag all particles to the center. So on top of the velocity field values, it could happen that particles are just moving out of the field and then they would just sit there or go on forever. And if that happens, I want to just drag them back to the center direction. Okay, the first thing we do here is we check, is a particle created or is a particle entering our particle group? So now you might say, which particle group is it? Because I'm just saying here, get p data, particle ID, and if data group enter. So if a particle enters the group. So which group is it? I told you the very important first input decides our global variables or what the instance of the multi-threading MEL gets. And this is what we see here. So it is our leader group, and we can see here, or we gather here, if a particle enters the leader group. So when the particles are created by our dynamic set here with the position born, when these particles are created and enter the group, I want to do something. The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that there is not a particle close by. So how can I do that? If I want to avoid creating a random particle near another particle or way too close to another particle, I would just use the function where I can check for close by particles. So to do that, first I need to get the position of the particle. So I'll create a variable that stores the position of my born particle. When it's entered, I get the position, and I'll grab the position with the control here data pos. So I'll get the position from my born particle, and I store the vector in this variable I just created up here, born position. So now in born position, there's my position of the particle that entered the group. So now I create a new variable close by, and this variable gives me just the amount of particles that are found in a certain radius. So I'll use the function leader in find, that's my particle group, and I'll just say my position is the born position, find within this radius of 1, find 5 particles, and then I want to know if these particles are close to this particle or not. And the last entry here is do not find myself. So I will exclude myself because it could be that another thread is finding this particle already, so I don't want to find myself. So here we have now the amount of particles around. So if all this is true, this is the if clause here. So we found a particle, or we have no value in the velocity field. So if there is no value in the velocity field, I don't want to create a particle because it would just sit there and in a standstill or go straight to the core, and I want to avoid that from the beginning. So what I'm doing here is I'll just kill with particle data die. I kill these particles. Either they just have no field velocity, or they have partners around or other particles close by, and then I also don't want to create it. So that's this part here. So the creation is controlled of our particle creation with these two conditions. Then in the next step, we are going to do the following. We are just choosing or checking if the particles are still moving. So if the particles are no longer moving, if the velocity is below a certain value, so the length of this vector 3 is below a certain value, I'll just add a little bit of kick for this particle. So I'll grab the position of our volume object, that's the center where the particles should go, and subtract the world position of the current particle position. So now I have the direction where I want to kick or direct the particle, and then I'll just add or subtract in that case, because I want to go into the center, I'll subtract this direction with the factor we have defined up here. So now if the particles are way too slow, I'll just direct them back to the center. This is this little thing here. The next thing we are doing is if we are either, or not either, We are checking here the center distance, or distance from the center, from the core. If we have reached the core and the center void is a radius from the center, I just want to stop creating a spline. So the spline ends at this radius from the center. And I do that by just changing the particle group into a spline ID. So the leader is no longer a leader, it's just the end knot, and the last spline, or the last knot, will just close the spline, and that's it. And we set it to velocity 0. That takes care of the center. So I just want to keep the center free. I just don't want to create one point where all splines end up. So the next thing is we set the particle data with a speed, a certain speed. So all our particles move around with the velocity field value, and I can just multiply the speed with this velocity field. And now here comes the spline drawing. So this draws or creates the spline. So the first thing we do is create a spline, an empty spline, or our first knot of the spline. And because I'm lazy, I'm doing here something, it's not really nice, but it works. I just use the particle ID created as a spline ID. So if particle 10,300 is created, I will create a spline ID of 10,300. So my particle ID is one-to-one my spline ID. So I always know this particle creates this spline. So the next thing we are doing here is we are creating the leader particle for this spline. So the first leader particle is created, and then we are just asking the generator create us some particles in between the movement from old to new position, which Trailborn does. So it creates it drops, let's say 5 or 10 particles, and then we are just adding these particles. So we are getting the trail count, how many particles have been created, and then we are adding these particles with the generator ID to PID, particle ID. I get the particle ID to this spline ID. So now I've created the spline, and it continues. Particles move, leaders move until we kill the leader or move the leader to another group, and it starts all over again. And then this is what we get. Particles start drawing, particles move in towards the center, and we have the void region where the particles just stop in the void area in here. So if we have that, how about let's visualize this or render this? And we can do that because our SplinePool has several options to create meshes. So let me just turn off the particles, and also let me turn off our spline visualization in the SplinePool. So I'll turn off the SplinePool visualization. And now let me just go back in and turn on the mesh. And now what we have here is the true mesh that we are creating for splines. So now we can render something, we can do even collision detection, whatever we want, we could do with it. So for the rendering, we did here something interesting. Let me just go into the environment. We are using finalRender, obviously, for rendering this. And in finalRender, we have a true, real volumetric rendering atmospheric effect. And there we just use a sphere gizmo, that's the gizmo here, that fills our volume light or volumetric effect. And I'll just pick the area light we have in the center here. And this effect will calculate our volumetric effect. And keep in mind, let me just start the rendering here. What we have here is a true volumetric global illumination path tracing effect, and it's true area lights inside of a volumetric effect with global illumination going on. So Pretty powerful stuff. And on top of it all, this is the wavelength spectral based renderer you're seeing here, just rendering these amazing effects with true volumetric light, area lights going on here. So I hope you liked this video. I hope it helps you creating some spline effects. I will do more spline videos soon, tutorial videos, and explain more in detail how to create simple spline effects and do animations. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you back again with our other videos. Goodbye.